Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, the movie actor Will Ferrell on George W. Bush and a former child soldier from Sudan with his extraordinary first-person story. But first, in 3 weeks' time, the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown will play host to a meeting of the G20, 19 of the world's largest economies plus the European Union. It's a grouping that includes not just the richest countries like the USA, Russia, China and Germany, but also emerging economies like Indonesia, Brazil and India. So what can they achieve? To discuss that and a whole host of global issues, I'm delighted to be joined here in the studio by the British Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, as we talk about G20 and then go on a world tour that will include Iran, Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, Northern Ireland, Russia, Israel, Iraq and Pakistan. Foreign Secretary David, it's a great joy to have you here today.
Great joy to be with you.
Tell me, coming up soon, at the end of this month, comes the G20 conference, 20 of the leading countries of the world. In one day, can anything really be achieved in terms of the currency crisis or global warming? I mean, what can be hoped for from that?
I think that the G20 summit on the 2nd of April is not just a chance for the world to come together and have a meeting. It's a chance for the countries that represent 85% of the world's GDP to actually agree actions. Actions in respect of the financial system, because there are key regulatory improvements that need to be made, but also take significant steps in terms of macroeconomic coordination, including the role of the IMF, but also extend the message, which is going to have to be about how we ensure that economic recovery is in the interests of the poor as well as the rich, and how economic recovery is sustainable because it's built on a low carbon basis. You can't provide all the answers in one day, but the truth is that over the last 20 or 30 years, economics has gone global and politics hasn't caught up. The chance on the 2nd of April is for politics to begin the process of catching up and taking decisions that affect people's lives.
And if they manage to do that, how long do you think it will be before the financial situation in the world begins to improve?
Well, anyone who makes predictions about that is foolish. I think that the length and the depth of the recession is becoming clearer. The global nature of the recession is also becoming clearer, because remember, if we'd been doing this interview 6 months ago, the question might have been, are you sure that every country is going to be affected? Surely countries that haven't had housing bubbles or other problems are not going to be affected. This is a genuine global recession. So I don't think the important thing now is to predict its length. What we know is that it's unique in nature and that it needs extraordinary steps. I mean, in Britain, not just taking over large sections of the banking system, but also printing money with 0%, 0.5% interest rates in the UK. In the US, a stimulus package of a size that hasn't been seen. But I think what's important is that we do ensure that countries come together and multiply their actions, because the truth is none of us are going to be able to get out of this on our own.
Right. Multiply their actions. That's a good slogan to come out of it. But of course, we won't know whether it's a success or not, something like G20 until a few months later when we see if it's worked.
Well, the test isn't the headlines. The test is going to be the effect in the real world. And we will be able to see that over a period. I think that it's very, very important that we recognise that this is an economic crisis, not just a financial crisis. So we need to address the financial system. We need to bottom out the problems that exist in the financial system. But issues of protectionism need to be addressed, because that is not the way forward. The crisis of the 1930s was in part the product of the 1929 crash, but it was also the product of the response to the crash. And the response can either make the problem worse or better. In respect to protectionism, we have to stand up very strongly for open trade. We also have to stand up and say that this crisis cannot be resolved at the expense of the poorer countries in the world. And that is the significance of a G20 meeting, not just a G7 meeting or a G8 meeting.
Right. Looking at some of the other situations in the world at the moment, with the situation, even allowing for some of the violence at the beginning of this week, given that the elections in Iraq were so successful, really, I mean, they were pretty peaceful and pretty democratic and so on and so forth, are we reaching the stage where it will be possible to say there's a change here, the Iraq war was a success?
Well, I think...
Do you think it was?
Well, I think the question now is not going to be whether or not you'll change people's minds about the rights and the wrongs of the original decision in 2003. People have fixed positions on that. Where I think we have reached a tipping point is saying to people, Iraq can make a different future for itself. I was in Baghdad and in Basra just 2 weeks ago. I walked down the Corniche along the Shatt al-Arab waterway in Basra. I could not have done that even 6 or 9 months ago. And I think what's happening in Iraq with the development of serious political parties committed to non-violence, determined to build up security structures that serve the people without discrimination, you've got a very significant change. Secondly, you've got an economic situation which, despite the fall in the oil price, is one that gives Iraq a hope of building a decent future for itself. And you've got growing Iraqi confidence about its role in the region, in the Middle East as a whole, the development of politics that can actually play a different role in the region. So I think for those, that's the tipping point we may be reaching. Not changing people's minds about 2003, but saying there's really something to play for over the next 5 years.
But do you think 2003 was a success to yourself personally?
Well, you can't say, after hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, it's too glib to say it's a success, because it's clearly things went wrong. I voted for the government in 2003 for Britain to join the coalition effort. I don't resile from that. But equally, it's important not to be glib, that things went wrong, and the fact that they went wrong cost many people their lives. So I think we've got to be very, very honest with people and say, in the end, historians will judge whether it was a success or a failure. And the truth is, the actions we take over the next 5 years are going to be critical to whether or not the last 5 years are judged as a success or a failure.
And among the things in that period will be, for instance, Afghanistan, and that obviously is crucial at the moment. Should we be talking to the Taliban, or in fact, unofficially, are we?
We should be talking to all those who are willing to play by the constitutional rules of Afghanistan. But the people who should be doing that so-called reconciliation are the Afghans. It's not about us doing it, it's about the Afghans doing it. Because we are in Afghanistan supporting the Afghan government, not to create a new British colony or a new American colony. We're there to support a government that's been elected, but without the support of an international coalition of 40 countries, would find its security forces getting rolled over. And that's why we're there supporting them. Is part of the future dividing the Taliban between those who are committed to al-Qaeda, ideologically committed to violence against the Afghan state, who want to recreate that incubator for international terrorism of the 1990s, divide those from the Taliban or people who are supporting the Taliban on a contingent basis for money or just out of fear? Of course we should engage with those who are willing to play by the constitutional rules.
Do we support Hamid Karzai more than it appeared a few weeks ago that the Americans did? I interviewed him right in the middle of that, and in fact Richard Holbrooke went there and was actually much more apparently but more leaning towards him than the publicity had been. Do we support Karzai? We
support the democratically elected president of Afghanistan, and that is Hamid Karzai. He's got a very tough job, but it's a job that he's been elected to do by the people of Afghanistan. And one of the important principles of British foreign policy is that we have to support institutions, not just individuals. And we support, in this case, strong democratic institutions that build up the capacity of the state to serve its citizens. Hamid Karzai is the elected president of Afghanistan, but in the end, the next president has to be chosen by the Afghan people, not by the British government.
And the next door neighbour is Pakistan. Now, this is a troubled area of the world, obviously. Would you say that the potential to be a powder keg, or whatever, is greater in the case of Afghanistan or Pakistan?
Well, I think that they have to be seen together. And the big change in America is that the new administration will see Afghanistan and Pakistan together. The situation in Pakistan is extremely dangerous. I would say it's very grave. I think Pakistan faces a mortal threat, not from India, but from domestic terrorism. And that domestic terrorism is so grave that I think that politicians in Pakistan need to come together. At the moment, the politicians are pointing their fingers at each other. In fact, they should be coming together and pointing their fingers at those who threaten the Pakistani people. And those are terrorists on the Afghan border, terrorists in the Punjab, who struck with such deadly effect in Mumbai, and terrorists who, after all, claimed the life of Benazir Bhutto in December 2007.
And yes, and the homegrown terrorists is it possible that we would need to provide military help to enable the government there to overcome the homegrown terrorists, if the homegrown terrorists, in their various ways, added up to a real threat tomorrow, as it were, or the next tomorrow, to the government?
Well, Pakistan has a very strong military, but it's a military that's been designed traditionally to face its ancient enemy, India.
Yes.
My point is, Pakistan's enemy today is not India. Pakistan's enemy today is domestic terrorism. Should we be supporting the Pakistani government and the military who work for it in developing an effective counter-insurgency strategy for that country? Yes. But does it have to be led by the Pakistanis? Yes. This is a Pakistani issue that needs to be led by the Pakistani government and Pakistani people, and we need to support them, and we're ready to do that.
Pakistan, of course, featured in the story of the contorted story of Binyan Mohammed and so on. We've got the situation, it was mentioned in the House of Commons again this week, where everybody is waiting, obviously, for the Attorney General's report on her investigations into Binyan Mohammed's case and so on. It's been 4.5 months. When do you expect it?
Well, we have an independent Attorney General who makes her own decision about whether or not there's any case for anyone to answer, any criminal case to be answered. But I want everyone watching this programme around the world to know that the British government is signed up to international conventions against torture for a reason. We abhor torture. We never condone or cooperate in torture. And whenever there are allegations that are made, we take them very, very seriously indeed. In the case of Binyan Mohammed, far from suppressing evidence about his case, it was the strenuous efforts of the British government that got the documents to him and to his defence counsel so that he could defend himself and in the end get the charges dropped. Far from ignoring his case, it was the British government that requested his release from Guantanamo Bay, which we've been calling to be closed for many years. And I think that we have an independent judicial system. We have an Attorney General who acts as an independent Justice Minister. We have to make sure that she's given the space to make her own decision. It's not for me to talk to her either about the substance of the case or the timing of the case. But what people around the world need to know is that the independent British judicial system is indeed that, and it will find justice without fear or favour.
Someone said yesterday, in fact, though, that the problem, and it's not because of the Attorney General, it's to any Attorney General, the one inherent conflict of interest in it is that she will be making a decision, unless it's passed to the Director of Public Prosecution, she will making a decision about, in fact, a government of which she is a part. I mean, if the case goes ahead, the government will effectively be in the dock, and she's part of the government. So there's a sort of slight conflict of interest.
But she's doing it with the Director of Public Prosecution. She's made clear about that. If she thinks there's sufficient basis for a prosecution, she will pass it to the police, and they will conduct their inquiries about anyone or any institution. And that's the important way that we safeguard not just our liberties at home, but our commitments abroad.
And in fact, that if there was a case, then those documents, the famous documents that were not revealed and so on, would be part of such a case, wouldn't they?
But the documents have been revealed to the court, and they have been revealed to Binyan Mohammed's defence lawyers, thanks to our evidence. There are American documents which the American government has to decide whether or not it wants to publish. The Obama administration has committed to review every case of state secrets privilege and decide whether or not those documents should remain secret. That's the right way for this to be done.
And in fact, does the fact of President Obama being there affect this case? It affects everything, I suppose.
Well, President Obama has said that he wants to close Guantanamo Bay, and he said that America will never practice anything that it could be considered to be torture. And that is a very important starting point. It's one that we very much welcome.
And so, if the case went ahead, you'd have to speak to the Americans about their documents to see whether they release them.
Well, we already have. We already have. And the Americans have set in train a process. They have some secret documents. This isn't a matter of justice for Mr. Mohammed in the short term, because he's been released, thanks to the efforts that we made to get him these documents. But the American government have said that they will review every case where state secrets privilege has been used to deny the publication of documents and decide whether or not they should be published.
We must take a short break there, but David Miliband and I will continue this fascinating world tour by turning to Iran in a minute.